I'd like us all to welcome Joyce Coffey, the founder and president of the Chicago-based Climate Resilience Consulting. Joyce's work focuses on developing practical and equitable strategies that enhance markets and communities through climate change adaptation. In 25 years of leadership experience, Joyce has worked with more than 300 organizations representing government and the private, nonprofit, philanthropic, and academic sectors. Joyce serves as either a director or the chairperson of 25 nonprofit boards and initiatives, in case anyone needed some aspirational motivation. Unsurprisingly, her busy schedule did not allow Joyce to join us in New York today, but we're very grateful she's able to join us virtually and share her thoughts on climate resilience, why it's considered to be the next frontier for community development in this, the critical climate decade. Joyce, over to you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. It is a real pleasure to be here, and I'm so delighted to spend some time with you. I presume that someone's going to be bringing up some slides in a moment, but let's just ground ourselves to say that for the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be looking together at some of the key climate change hazards and how they relate to community development. And then we'll be exploring the intersection of climate change and social equity. And finally, we'll be looking at some strategies that will help us to really build climate change resilience in our practice. So next slide, please. Bottom line, we're really looking here at these hazards of extreme heat, which is the biggest killer, the flooding, wildfire, and knock-on impacts of these climate hazards. And we're understanding that those impacts are also intersecting with other parts of our American experience: aging infrastructure, deferred maintenance, changing technology, and unsustainable land use among them. And of course, we're going to also get into our racist history and our racist current processes that make this even worse for certain communities. So next slide, please. What we're really talking about here is a curve that many of you have likely seen. This is the greenhouse gas emissions curve. And when we talk about it, we typically are asking ourselves, how can we get to the Paris Agreement lowest emission pathway? But in the adaptation context, we're saying we are understanding that climate change is already happening and it's going to get worse. And it's our responsibility to handle that gap between what our aspirational lowest impact of greenhouse gases is and what our actual greenhouse gas emissions are. Next slide, please. So when we think about what's already happening in the climate change context, let's just remind ourselves that we've already had our first major climate bankruptcy. Pacific Gas and Electric filed for bankruptcy in 2019 after catastrophic life-losing fires, $30 billion in liabilities. In 2020, in fact, there were global losses from natural disasters of over 200 billion. Less than 100 billion of those were insured, and we know that lower income and marginalized populations are underinsured due to historic injustice in the financial services industry primarily, and so these numbers really are not truly reflective of the loss of personal assets. We also see that in the US, there is a huge overvaluation in our residential properties due to the fact that they're very much in flood risk zones and increasingly being developed in those zones. And finally, as I mentioned, heat, the biggest killer. Not only that, it has a huge impact on productivity, and the data show that by 2030, we should be losing up to 80 million full-time jobs a year due to extreme heat impacts. So next slide, please. We think a lot about climate risks from the perspective of its physical impacts. I do want to make sure that we're grounding ourselves in the human experience of climate risk, and I'm not going to go through this entire slide, but just keep in mind that our bodies are definitely impacted by extreme weather, especially heat, but also the impacts of climate risk on water and food supply, and not to mention something that's actually not included on this slide, but the trauma of repeated loss from extreme events, or even just the anticipation of extreme events if you've previously experienced impacts in your home or with your community. Next slide, please. So what do some of those impacts look like from the perspective of maybe credit unions, but especially household income? In the United States, we have 72 million properties that are at risk from wildfire, just as one example. Next slide. And we have even more properties that are, fewer properties, but due to different types of flooding, also at risk. And I do want to point out that most of the news that we see about climate change impacts has to do with flooding at the coast, so tidal flooding, but in fact, it's riverine flooding that takes more properties. And in any of the large urban centers, we often have combined sewer overflows that cause disasters for individual families that never make it to the news, but are equally devastating. Next slide, please. So I want to just pause for a moment and say that Angela Russell set us up so well for the next 15 minutes together, because Angela pointed out that climate change risks are disproportionate on marginalized populations, and climate change impacts hit those who are poor and otherwise underserved first and worst, and their recovery is also hampered by injustice. So next slide, please. Let's just look at some of that. I mean, we're not going to be able to get into all of it today, but and please keep in mind that racial inequity is an overarching disproportionate impact to some of these other elements that are, for instance, identified in the 4th U.S. National Climate Assessment, which was a climate assessment that came out in the Trump administration. So children, older adults, lower income people all have higher risks from climate change impacts. In addition, if you live in a manufactured or mobile home, if you have no access to a vehicle, if you do not speak English as your first language, if you are a renter, and so on, all of these things make you much more vulnerable. Next slide, please. In addition, of course, when we think about household wealth, we often think about that from the perspective of the jobs that someone is able to hold, the income that they receive from those jobs, but also especially the sustainability, security, and stability of their home. So I just wanted to take a moment to look at vulnerability and exposure from the perspective of different housing types or different eras of a house's life. So, in the case of flooding, if your home already is in need of repair, or your home is already in a floodplain, even that which the federal government currently claims is a floodplain, which of course is not the true floodplain, since the maps that the federal government is using currently are still based on historic information, not on the predicted impacts of the very, very sure science that shows what scenarios will bring in terms of future flooding. So, we think about the fact, for instance, in the context of extreme heat, that lower income residents either lack air conditioning or are not able to pay for air conditioning and are worried that their entire electricity will be shut off if they use the air conditioning that they do have, since they can't pay their bills at those higher rates. Also, neighborhoods that don't have as much green space or are not as close to natural areas, like to a coast or a river or a forest, have many, much greater heat risk from the urban heat island impact. So in any case, you can just imagine in the groups that you serve how the place that one lives and the quality of that place can increase our vulnerability. Next slide, please. So I feel as though at other moments in this conference, and certainly in other moments of your careers, you have hopefully been asked to really address the question of root causes of inequity. And it's more important than ever that we do that, since climate change is the biggest challenge of our era, and it is the humanitarian crisis of our time. So if we don't address the root causes of humanitarian crisis, then things are going to be much worse for especially marginalized communities. So I'm not going to go into any of these in detail, but please do keep in mind that, for instance, political disenfranchisement, increased neighborhood violence and crime, lack of living wage jobs, all of these contribute to an increased vulnerability to climate change. Next slide, please. So one thing that we do in our equitable climate resilience practice is we're always looking to move along the continuum from mainstreaming climate resilience, which may be where many of you are in your work, trying to ask the climate risk question of everything you do. How will increasing weather, how will increasing rain when we don't need it and less when we do, how will increasing heat, how will increasing risk of wildfire affect our work? So that's a mainstreaming, when you answer that question and then try to make changes. But we would also hope for a transformation. That is, when we think about resilience, it's a lot easier to do it in wealthy communities or where the answers to those questions are very sure. It's a lot harder to do it when we're trying to actually transform the systems that got us into this place in the first place. So thinking along the continuum, moving yourself as a leader towards more transformative solutions. Next slide, please. And I'll just end this section to say that it's not just Joyce who's thinking about these things. It's not just climate resilience consulting, but there are many, many resources at your disposal for equitable, community-driven climate preparedness, for climate resilience planning that's community-driven, for making equity real in climate adaptation. And I really recommend many of these resources to you, and I can put some of them in the chat after my presentation if that would be useful. Next slide, please. And there is one tool that is universally available. Of course, it has some warts, but you should definitely avail yourself of the environmental justice screening tool from the EPA to at least understand some of the risks that the communities that you're serving face, and to understand them from the context of the environmental and climate impacts currently prevailing and also increasing over time. So next slide here. So now we're going to go into the latter part of the formal remarks, and then I'm really eager for all of your questions, and there'll be ample time for that. I think it's really important that all of us understand that we need to be leaders in a climate change future. We need to be leaders adding this element of climate risk and the possibility for climate resilience and a real renaissance in communities that we care about through the driver of climate. That's really our aim, is to save lives and improve livelihoods, even in the face of climate change disruption. So here are a few mechanisms that I think you all could imagine using in your portfolios. Thanks. The first one is resilience hubs, which you may be hearing buzz about. There's some great websites out there about them. And in fact, many of the community serving buildings that are already in your portfolios, or maybe that your kids already go to for after school. I heard some high school parents in the audience from the last session. These could be considered resilience hubs, but a resilience hub is something that is a source of trusted information, a place of really thriving resources for especially marginalized communities in the everyday context. And then when the risk hits, when the community is hit first and worst by the climate impacts, it's a place where people can go for refuge, for maybe a cooling center, or even, in fact, to be in higher ground. And also in the recovery phase, it's a place where people can find information. They can have their diabetes drugs refrigerated. They can have food packs for their children, and they can have a safe place to reconnoiter with their families, and so on. So these are an increasingly interesting method, including for the federal government, by the way. So be thinking about the Boys and Girls Clubs in your neighborhoods, the churches, the other religious sanctuaries, the YMCAs, and other things as potentially places where you might therefore also put in, for instance, a solar-powered generator, or extra refrigeration, or a small kitchenette, things that could make it easier in the event of extreme a disaster of any sort, including heat, impacting the community in ways that you don't wish. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to go into all of these things here, but I did want to just ask ourselves at this moment, after 14 minutes of our presentation today, to just think about, where is the climate resilience opportunity in the work that I do? Am I involved in communications? Do I work in policy? Have I been involved with public facilities and how they are carried out in service to communities? Because if so, every part of that work is potential for climate resilience. And next slide, please. The first thing that you might do in whatever answer you gave to that question is to look at a national risk index and see if where the physical location is of the work that you do, what are they facing? What risks do they have? And once you know that, you can't unknow it. Then every communication that you're having, or any conversation that with yourself, any decisions that you're making, you know them with regard to the risks that you face. And FEMA does have a national risk index, which is simple to use and has good, clear, basic information that I think is very useful. Next slide, please. If you're really love data, if you're a GIS kind of person, or maps really thrill you, there are many, many other resources that can help you get in even deeper. Some of them are governmental, others of them are private sector, including the First Street Foundation, which has riskfactor.com, which is very widely used. And even if you are searching for a home or want to know what your current property, whether you're a renter or an owner, what the impact is, go to realtor.com and click on the flood impact, wildfire impact, air quality, and see what they have to say, because they're actually using the risk factor information, and it's a free and easy way to have a look. Next slide, please. So if after you've done your examination of your own portfolio, what parts might have some climate resilience opportunity. And then you've said, okay, I've assessed these risks. The next thing you might do is to ask, well, where could I find a return on investment by actually being a resilience pioneer in my work? By asking the question, how can we build resilience in this project? Well, one of the things that people often say is it's too expensive. We can't do it. We don't have money for what we need to do already. But the bottom line is that climate resilience has a return. And these data actually come from the federal government, again, in the Trump administration, which I call out just to say that this is not a political issue. These are the facts, that you can actually earn money by avoiding risk. You can make your balance sheet a lot stronger through that, and also through the collateral benefits, the dividends that are paid by avoiding that risk in the future and creating something more robust for today. And I think the Resilience Hub is an easy way to kind of understand that, right? If you have a community serving building that everyone is really charged up about, and it's helping people to get better jobs or women to have better daycare for their kids, or whatever the case may be, you can see how that's a benefit. And then, of course, that it's paying back, especially in the event of a disaster. So next slide, please. You've looked at your DOI, and now you might be looking at playing with your resilience choices. And I really do think of this a little bit like a game, like every single thing in your community. What would it take to be more resilient? And what are the choices that we have about that resilience? And we'll get into some of those choices in a moment. I don't want to go into those in the slide here, but next slide, please. I think the biggest choice that many of us have is to keep in mind the value of making good land use decisions. So in our communities right now, there is new development going on, very likely in very risky places. And the real estate market is not a market that looks ahead, but beyond the 12 months or even the quarter of a board call, or the 12 months of investment, or maybe the 24 to 48 months of an investment. And of course, climate risk looks beyond that. And so it's important for land use choices to really help us to understand where we should be developing and where we should not, and where there is, in fact, already high risk, how we can help those communities to make a dignified exit, or to make a dignified choice about how they're going to shore up not only their homes, but their small businesses and their roads. Because it's going to be very expensive to do that. And if we don't make these really specific land use choices, and even if we do, frankly, it's very likely that those who have less power and less money are likely to be left, flooded and not well cared for, and not able to have the agency to make choices about where they live and where they work and where their kids go to school and how they care for their parents, and all those things that are just fundamental to, hopefully being, a proud American. So in fact, I think that if there were one thing that I hope you took away from our conversation today, it is the real value of looking at land use and asking, how can we make things denser? How can we be sure that we're not digging up wetlands and filling them in with new housing, therefore making the sponge function of our communities much less and making our flooding downstream much worse? How can we ensure that we're not building on the coast, but maybe a coastal view? Maybe we're not at river's edge, but we're river view, or even a little further away from that. So please do consider this when you're thinking about how you're supporting your communities. Next slide, please. I'm about to wrap here, and I just wanted to point out that, as we've been talking, you might be thinking in your own portfolio about some of the things that you can do, and you might even start to create a little table for yourself about what are some no-cost things we can do, and then what are the things that we need to begin saving money for, or looking for funding for, or demanding of our representatives when we vote for them that they find resources for us for. So there's a lot of ways to prioritize these things. Next slide, please. And of course, we also want to be sure that as we are mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, that is making things more energy efficient, doing more renewable energy, we're making sure that we're doing so in a way that acknowledges that climate risk exists. So people are always demanding of me, please don't forget greenhouse gas mitigation. And I don't. I started with that today. The most important thing we can do to adapt to climate change is to decrease greenhouse gas emissions. But I'm also asking that any work that you're doing in greenhouse gas reduction really look to see, is it adaptive? Because if we're putting in infrastructure, for instance, for the next 20, 30, 100 years, it sure better be ready for the future weather that we see. So next slide here, one of my two last, I do want to point out that at this point, many of you can't unknow what we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes and are probably a little bit worried. Maybe you were coming into this already, your high school students are already, the kids in your family. And it really is important that we use the tools that we have in our own selves and in our communities to activate hope. Because, as I said, humanitarian crisis of our time, but also a huge opportunity for building resilience. So the last slide, please, I'll just end here and then we can go to your questions, is to just point out that equitable resilience really depends on us as individuals, whether we inhabit a white body or not, whether we have agency in our communities. Those in particular, if we are white and we have agency in our communities or in our workforce, we need to do something about it. So there's a lot of words here about working collectively, sharing responsibility, creating solutions, and finally, targeting resources to create resilience benefits in underserved communities, because it is a lot easier to serve climate resilience to wealth. And that is actually how the federal government historically has done it, because of the way that they've worked their return on investment calculations, their cost benefit analysis, their CBA analysis. So, being really mindful of how we show up every day to ensure that the vast majority of our day is focused on how we target resources to underserved communities after having worked with them to determine what it is that they want and need. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Last slide here, and then we can take the deck off. I'm really eager for your questions, your critiques, and so grateful for the chance to be together today as you work in all of your contexts to create sustainability and security and safety for your communities, and hopefully also doing that in the context of climate change disruption.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I now have a better idea of how Joyce manages to serve on 25 different boards. Joyce has access to an extra gear that not everyone has that lets her operate in 1.5 speed. There was so much information packed into that presentation. There's like the informational equivalent of a superfood. Lots of stuff to digest in there in all of those slides. I'm sure some people will take the deck away and really sink into it. But are there any questions in the room right now? I didn't see any come in the chat yet. While people are thinking, I'll start with one. Community resilience has really a macro approach because we're talking about the community in general, but communities are made up of individuals, and so there is also this micro concern of the individuals who are in the community, and I think probably credit unions are going to see a lot of action on that sort of level. I'm wondering if, let me contextualize my question. Our advisory council for United in Sustainability met yesterday, and one of the things we heard from our presenter there was that community members coming in might be sort of generically interested in sustainability and that sort of thing, but for them to make a decision about something like developing their own the property that they might own, they're going to need some information that takes this out of the realm of the abstract and makes it more concrete. Here's how much money you could save, for example, by maybe putting solar panels on your home. Are there good resources for credit unions to provide to their membership that might give them that sort of information they can pass along to their members?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say, first of all, that National Institute of Building Sciences data is really valuable for that. And I'm happy to, a little bit later today, share that information in the chat here. Also, some of the big financial services firms have done some of their own, not even back of the envelope calculations, but actually balance sheet calculations on return on investment. So I can find a couple of those reports and share them with you, because I think you're really right that we have to, for certain conversations, start with the money. But I also wanted to mention, you mentioned United in Sustainability. One easy way that I sometimes help with these conversations is to say that for a long time we were thinking about sustainability, like how can our human impact on the environment be less? And now, in the context of climate change resilience, we're asking how can the impact of the environment on humans be less? So we're really centering the humans as that which needs the help. And sometimes that can help someone who might otherwise think of like the environment as an abstraction to realize, oh my gosh, you're talking about the families that I serve. I get it. So those are just two thoughts that came to mind in your excellent question.
Like that. Any questions from the group here? You've left us with so much information to digest. I'm really looking forward to diving into those resources. I want to thank you once again, Joyce, for being here with us today. One more round of applause for Joyce Coffey.
Thank you all. I really appreciate you.
Joyce has also recently authored a chapter in a book by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York called What's Possible? Investing for Prosperous, Sustainable Neighborhoods. The Fed has provided us with copies of that book for free. I know they're going to be available for sure tomorrow. They might be scheduled to arrive sometime later today. I'm not sure if they're here right now at this moment, but they will be available for you to pick up. I want to extend our thanks to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, especially Javier Silva, the Director of Community Engagement, for providing those. The book also features a chapter by Kathy Mann, the President and CEO of Inclusive, who will be speaking tomorrow at our panel of experts. So be sure to get your hands on a copy of that and join us tomorrow for that talk.